Setting gender identity free. Expanding treatment for transsexual inmates. Written by Wright, Colopy. Table of contents. Introduction. Chapter 1. Transsexualism defined. Chapter 2. Legal and social developments demonstrating increased acceptance of transsexuals. Eighth Amendment provisions for inmate healthcare. Chapter 3, then Chapter 4. The Eighth Amendment requires gender identity disorder treatment. And finally, the conclusion. Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway and don't block up the hall, for he that gets hurt will be who has stalled. There is a battle outside and it's raging. It'll soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times, they are a-changing. We are in a new era in which diagnosis has such social and political implications that one is constantly on the front lines fighting on issues our forebears were spared. Introduction. Historically, courts and legislators have been reluctant to establish legal protections for transgender and transsexual people in the United States. This may be due, in part, to the slow pace at which American society itself has come to accept this very misunderstood psychological and biological phenomenon. Unfortunately, as scientific research and social acceptance mature, this minority is beginning to enjoy greater rights and recognition. Fortunately, as scientific research and social acceptance mature, this minority is beginning to enjoy greater rights and recognition. Sorry about that. In recent years, the transgender community has enjoyed significant changes in law and society. In February 2010, the U.S. Tax Court in Donna Bain and Commissioner ruled that sex transitioning treatments were tax deductible. The following November, the first openly transsexual judge in the nation was elected in California bench. Anti-discrimination legislation protecting jobs and housing is becoming increasingly popular, and affordable care removed some barriers to better health care. These changes demonstrate greater legal recognition and social acceptance for transgender people in the United States. More importantly, these are changes that promote the interest of all transsexual citizens, not just the few who cry out and demand justice for themselves. While a U.S. tax court ruling may not influence how all state and federal courts will interpret the rights of transgender people in the other contexts, it may convince some that social expectations are changing and that action is required to guarantee constitutionally entitled protections. Sorry about the movement and mispronunciation. Trying to get better at this. The Eighth Amendment's history perhaps best reflects how courts have expanded constitutional protections in light of evolving social standards of decency. The Eighth Amendment's simple language belays the array of protections it grants prison inmates and the duties it imposes on prison officials, including the foremost duty to provide for inmates' basic needs. Adequate, if minimal, healthcare is well recognized as a basic need. Transgender inmates face greater struggles than much of the non-incarcerated transgender community. Some advocates for transsexual inmates' rights argue that prisons should provide the full treatment series, psychotherapy, hormone therapy, and sex reassignment surgery, prescribed by the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, WPATH. Standards of care. WPATH, or WPATH, is an international organization that promotes greater understanding and appropriate care for those suffering from transgender identity disorder. The standards of care represent the international medical community's consensus on the required care for transgender people. These advocates contend that given the unique needs of transsexuals, denying the full treatment series violates the 18th Amendment. The 8th Amendment. However, my own analysis demonstrates that any treatments beyond psychotherapy and hormones exceed the constitutionally mandated degree of care. In this note, I argue that 1. The standard of adequate medical care requires only sex-appropriate hormone therapies for those transsexual inmates that need them. 2. Sexual reassignment surgery is, in most cases, beyond the threshold of minimal adequate care and thus not required by the 8th Amendment. And 3. Prisons must provide housing that ensures the safety of transsexual inmates and the proper administration of adequate health care. Part 1. We'll discuss general background information concerning what transsexualism is, the treatments prescribed by the medical community, and the significant problems transsexuals face in the United States. Part 2 will introduce the tax court's case of O. Donovan and versus Commissioner and other indicia of improving social, legal, and political situations for transsexuals. Part 3 will discuss 8th Amendment protections for inmate health care and case law demonstration problems with current prison policies regarding care for transsexual inmates. Part 5 will purpose changes to prison policies so as to balance the respective constitutional rights and duties of inmates and officials. Transsexualism defined. Part 1. For most people, there is no disparity between how their body develops sexually and how they self-identify their gender. It is therefore difficult for many to understand the legal and social difficulties that transgender and transsexual people must endure in the United States. That our society's standards of decency have only recently progressed to the point of accepting transgender and transsexual people is best revealed by examination of the legal and social prejudices that systematically deny their participatory rights. This begins with understanding what exactly it is about transsexualism medically and socially that makes individuals with conditions easy prey for social prejudice. Understanding the relationship between gender and sex. To understand transgender people, the distinction between sex and gender must also be understood. Transgenderism exists because sex, not gender, are not necessarily identical. Sex is an objective physical attribute determined by an individual's primary sex organs, the genitalia. No one has direct influence over how their own or another sex develops in the womb. Postnatal sex, however, may be decided perhaps arbitrarily when the child's genitalia is ambiguous or disfigured by a careless circumcision. Let me try that one more time. To understand transgender people, the distinction between sex and gender must also be understood. Transgenderism exists because sex and gender are not necessarily identical. Sex is an objective physical attribute determined by an individual's primary sex organs, the genitalia. No one has direct influence over how their own or another sex develops in the womb. Postnatal sex, however, may be decided, perhaps arbitrarily, when the child's genitalia is ambiguous or is disfigured by a careless circumcision. Gender is completely subjective and better understood as sense of self. Gender identity may be suppressed, but it cannot be changed. There is an increasing amount of scientific evidence that gender, sex, incongruity is related to how the brain structure that governs gender develops in response to sex hormones in the womb. This does not mean that transgender people have brain deformities. Instead, the gender-sex incongruity only means that the brain developed under different hormonal influences than the rest of the body. It is also important to distinguish the terms transgender and transsexual. Transgender people are those individuals whose subjective gender does not align with their objective sex. Transgender is an umbrella category that includes transsexuals as a unique subset. Transsexuals are transgender individuals who feel that their physical sex is so divergent from their mental gender that they Transsexuals are transgender individuals who feel that their physical sex is so divergent from their mental gender that they may want to make the physical alterations to align their sex with their gender, or to make their body feel right for their mind. Unfortunately, social understanding often lags behind scientific discovery. All too often, transsexualism is misconstrued as just another facet of homosexuality, or degraded as a sexual perversion or a mere psychological delusion. But transsexualism does not bear relation to sexual proclivity, sexual orientation, or mental illnesses. Proclivity, a tendency to choose or do something regularly, an inclination or predisposition toward a particular thing. Rather, it is entirely concerned with self-identification of gender identity. No gender identity precludes anyone from being heterosexual, straight, homosexual, gay, lesbian, or identify as queer. It is easier for society to dismiss and marginalize transgender people as exceptionally rare freaks when people are unaware of how many transgender people there are in their population. Transgenderism is far from rare. One survey estimates that only 2 to 5%, 1 in 50 to 1 in 20 of Americans are transgender. Transsexualism, however, is quite rare, with birth rates of only about 0.00833%, 1 in 12,000, male to female, and 0.00333% in 1 in every 30,000 female to male individuals. When contrasted with an estimated 4 to 5%, 1 in 25 to 1 in 20 of males, and 2 to 3%, 1 in 50 to 1 in 35 of females being born homosexual, it is easier to comprehend how minuscule and how easily ignored a sexual and social minority transsexuals are. The real hurdle that transsexuals face is the social and perhaps cultural predisposition towards viewing sex and gender as a naturally aligned binary phenomenon. Our society prefers to the conception that an individual at birth will be, by biological necessity, be only a male or female in mind and body for life. For many, raised according to this view, it is difficult to comprehend that sex and gender do not go hand in hand, and that in neither case does one cause the other. Neither transgenderism nor transsexualism is a mental illness. However, transsexuals as a class suffer from a condition called gender identity disorder or gender dysphoria, which arises from the severity of their gender-sex incongruity. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, version 4 or 4th edition, DSM-4, currently lists GID as a psychological disorder. GID is described as GID is described as estimated at a much higher prevalence of transsexualism in population, 1 in 3,639 males to females, and 1 in 22,714 females to males. Some notes here. It is an interesting point that the DSM is used to list homosexuality as a psychological disorder for some time as well. The DSM-1, published in 1952, classified homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance, and the DSM-2, published in 1968, reclassified homosexuality as a sexual deviation and as sexual orientation disturbance. To accompany the removal of homosexuality as an illness per se from the DSM-3 in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association issued this statement. Whereas homosexuality in and of itself implies no impairment in judgment, stability, reliability, or vocational capabilities, therefore, be it resolved that the American Psychiatric Association deplores all public and private discrimination against homosexuals in such areas as employment, housing, public accommodations, and licensing, and declares that no burden of proof of such judgment, capacity, or reliability shall be placed on homosexuals greater than that imposed on any other persons. Further, the APA supports and urges the enactment of civil rights legislations at local, state, and federal laws that would ensure homosexual citizens the same protections now guaranteed to others. Further, the APA supports and urges the repeal of all legislation making criminal offenses of sexual acts performed by consenting adults in private. in the health matrix. Part 1, Exhibit A, strong and persistent cross-gender identification, not merely a desire for any perceived cultural advantages of being the other sex. Part 2, persistent discomfort with his or her sense of inappropriateness in the gender role of that sex. Third characteristic, disturbance that is not concurrent with a physical intersex condition. And fourth, disturbance that causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Let me try that again, I'm sorry. Disturbance that causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Gender dysphoria has been more simply described as the discomfort felt when one's physical gender assigned at birth is incongruous with one's gender identity. Although the categorization, I'm kind of sleepy, as a mental disorder implies that the disturbance comes from within external pressure to conform to cultural sexual norms contributes to the identity discomfort. Naturally, for many reasons, controversy regarding inclusion of GID in the DSM-4 abounds. Despite the inherent negative connotations of a mental or psychological disorder, many transsexuals recognize that their best path to receiving benefits under current medical policies is grounding in having a clinically categorized condition. Part B, effective therapies for treating gender identity disorder. For transsexuals wanting to pursue sexual transformation, WPATH drafted the Standards of Care. The Standards of Care represents the international medical community's consensus on treatment of GIDs. These guidelines detail a clinical sequence of escalating treatments that facilitate a controlled transitioning, ensuring that patients receive only those treatments that are medically warranted. The sequence first calls for psychiatric therapy, followed by hormonal sex reassignment with psychiatric approval. Then, the patient must complete a real-life experience of no less than 1 year during which he or she lives fully in his or her community as the intended sex. Finally, after successful real-life experience with approval of 2 psychiatrists, the patient may undergo surgical sex reassignment. Given that the suffering arises from the incongruity, the only effective remedy is to bring subjective gender and objective sex into harmony. The ultimate goal of the clinical process is not just physical transformation, but also to improve the patient's psychological well-being and chances for self-fulfillment in society. Without these therapies, transsexuals are at risk of serious psychological problems beyond GID, such as depression, anxiety, self-mutilation, and suicidal tendencies. Unfortunately, for many transsexuals, seeking this care is prohibitively expensive. The estimated cost for female-to-male surgery is approximately $50,000. Male-to-female surgeries can cost as much as $100,000. Comparatively, hormone treatment is inexpensive. Hormones can cost between $300 and $2,400 per year, depending on the brand and dosage prescribed. In a single year, the Department of Corrections spent only $4,400 on hormones for 2 inmates. These procedures and treatments are rarely covered by health insurance and government-funded healthcare assistance, and most transgender people do not even have insurance for regular healthcare needs. Only recently has the Internal Revenue Service granted medical expense tax deductions to help defray the costs. Although the cost of treatment is high, it is not the highest hurdle transsexuals must overcome. Due to discrimination in the workplace and housing market, many transsexuals cannot adequately provide for themselves or pay for the procedures that will improve their quality of life. Social and economic problems transsexuals endure. Part C. As suggested earlier, GID may be the result of external social forces. Unlike social and ethnic minorities, homosexuals, and the physically and mentally disabled, neither transgender people nor transsexuals are explicitly protected by federal anti-discrimination laws. While transsexuals have legally recognized psychiatric conditions that would otherwise be covered by Americans with Disabilities Act, the Act specifically excludes transsexuals as well as transvestism and GID. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has also historically not granted transgender and transsexual plaintiffs explicit protection. Beginning in the 1970s, when plaintiffs alleged that they were fired due to their transsexual status, the circuit courts rejected arguments that the term sex, as protected under Title VII, incorporates gender, which encompasses transsexuals, and held that the statute only maintains the traditional notions of sex. The Ninth Circuit supported this plain reading conclusion by denying a narrow interpretation of Title VII raised equal protection issues, asserting that transsexuals are neither a suspect class nor a discrete and insular minority, as categorized by an immutable characteristic determined solely by the accident of birth. The Seventh Circuit went so far as to say that even if one believes that a woman can be so easily created from what remains of a man, discrimination must be based on being a woman and not a transsexual for Title VII to apply. This rule foreclosed any hope for relief in the workplace for many years. Discrimination against transgender and transsexual people is based on either direct knowledge of gender identity status or non-conforming expressions of gender identity. A 2009 survey of several thousand transgender and transsexual people in the United States reported that 13% of transgender people were unemployed, 26% had been fired due to their transgender status, and 97% reported being harassed at work. The poverty rates are even more shocking. 27% earn less than $20,000 and 15% earn less than $10,000. In the general population, only 7% reported less than $10,000. It is clearly evident that transsexual individuals disproportionately suffer from economic inequalities. When it comes to housing discrimination, there are no protections, and given their higher rates of poverty, many transgender people end up living on the streets. In the 2009 survey, 11% of transgender people had been evicted due to their transgender status, and 19% had been or were currently homeless. Without a stable place to live or work in the legitimate economy, many transsexuals must choose between poverty or criminal activity in the sex and drug trades to pay for black market health care or just to survive day to day. As a result, transsexuals have become an overrepresented minority in prisons where they face even greater neglect and victimization. The total U.S. combined state and federal prison population is just over 2 million inmates. As of January 2011, there were roughly 210,000 inmates in federal prisons. A 2007 survey estimated that 50 to 100 transsexual inmates were held in federal facilities, comparing even the more common male to female transsexual birth rate of 1 in 12,000 to the estimated rate in federal prison of 1 in 2,100. It becomes evident that transsexual incarceration rates are disproportionate to those of the general population. There must be some sociological or economic reasons behind this, because it is clear that being born with a gender-sex incongruity does not make one naturally more inclined to commit a crime. Fortunately, it appears that some of the factors, access to insurance, political representation, and judicial protection that contribute to this proportionate incarceration rate are improving, giving hope that these rates will become more proportionate and transsexual individuals will have a greater chance at social fulfillment. Part 2. Legal and social developments demonstrating increased acceptance of transsexuals. Odanbian versus Commissioner. In February 2010, the U.S. tax courts decided a precedent-setting case in an issue of first impression that significantly advanced the entrance and legal recognitions of transsexuals in the United States. Odanbian was born a genetic male with ambiguous male genitalia. She lived as a man and even raised a family, despite feeling very uncomfortable in the male gender role. While in psychotherapy, Odanbian revealed her belief that she was really female despite having a male body. Due to the discord between her subjective gender identity and objective sex, she suffered from depression, low self-esteem, and anxiety. Consequently, Odanbian psychiatrist started her on treatment in accordance with the WPATH standards of care. Odanbian completed the full course, culminating in the transformation from male to female, and responded positively both emotionally and physically. Because these procedures were not covered by her health insurance or any government-funded health care system, Odanbian itemized the cost as deductions her federal income tax returns under IRC 213. IRC 213 permits taxpayers to deduct medical expenses that are not compensated by insurance or otherwise for medical care of the taxpayer, to the extent that such expenses exceed 7.5% of adjusted gross income. Medical care includes the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, and prevention of the disease, or for the purpose of affecting any structure or function of the body. Medical care does not, however, cover cosmetic surgery, unless the surgery or procedure is necessary to ameliorate a deformity arising from a congenital abnormality. The purpose of cosmetic surgery is only to improve appearance. It does not meaningfully promote the proper function of the body or prevent or treat illness or disease. The issue before the court was whether Old-Danabian sex reassignment hormone treatments and surgeries were merely cosmetic alterations or actually treated a disease or condition. The court began its analysis by stating that tax deductions are strictly confined to expenses for medical care that prevents or alleviates physical or mental defects or illnesses. The court ruled that GID constituted a disease under Article 213. The court then evaluated the relationship between the malady and the treatment based on two key values. First, the court stated that in matters relating to the health care of an individual, it gives deference to the medical judgments of the practitioner who treated the patient taxpayer. Second, giving a legitimate medical concern, the treatment should bear a direct or proximate therapeutic relation to the need. The tax court therefore concluded that hormone therapy and genital reassignment surgery are effective treatments for GID. However, the court noted that breast augmentation surgery was not an effective treatment and was merely cosmetic. The court therefore allowed Old-Danabian to deduct the expenditures for her transformation other than for breast augmentation. This exemplifies expanding protections and assistance for transgender and transsexual interests in the United States, and marks a trend towards easing the financial burdens of those wishing to make the transformation. Furthermore, analyzing what is or not taxed, such as cigarettes or alcohol, or what is tax deductible, such as charitable donations or necessary medical treatments, may serve as a good measure for what public values. In regards to transsexual inmates, this decision introduced two compelling factors related to GID treatment. The care provided must meet the patient's specific diagnosis, and only qualified and experienced medical personnel may make decisions regarding that care. Positive indications of evolving standards of decency. Transgender and transsexual people have not only made progress in the courthouse, but also among the general population, in congressional halls, with important initiatives that will improve their social standing and quality of life. Electoral success is a very clear signal that a political and social minority is gaining traction, demonstrating that the people trust them to manage public affairs. In November 2010, Victoria Kolakowski was elected to California Superior Court in Alameda County. Your Highness, sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. Elected official Kalowski underwent sex reassignment surgery in 1991 and is the first openly transgender trial court judge in the United States. While it is likely that other sitting judges are transgender, Kolokowski is the first to be elected despite being open about her transsexual status and surgery. This victory demonstrates a remarkable step for transgender people into the public arena. Kolokowski is the most prominent example of electoral success, but she is not alone in making political headway for the transgender community. Legislation has also been developed at local, state, and federal levels to provide explicit protections against gender identity-based discrimination for transgender individuals. Since 1994, the Employment Discrimination Act has been repeatedly put before Congress in one form or another. Despite widespread support among House members and the general public, it has not yet passed. While there are no federal protections yet, 13 states and the District of Columbia have passed anti-discrimination laws prohibiting discrimination based on gender identity. Unfortunately, these protect little more than a third of the U.S. population. However, the circuit courts have demonstrated a progressive willingness to protect transsexuals under Title VII. The nation's circuit courts recognize that although the exact wording of Title VII may not protect transsexuals, there are other characteristics of transsexuals' identity that can serve as the basis for a cause of action. Beginning with Smith versus City of Salem, the Sixth Circuit upheld a verdict in favor of the transsexual plaintiff on the grounds that the discrimination stemmed from the plaintiff's failure to conform to sex stereotypes by expressing less masculine and more feminine mannerism and appearance. However, this new interpretation is not without limits. An employer may discharge a transsexual employee if that employee's gender identity expression raises an overriding concern. In Etcity versus Utah Transit Authority, the 10th Circuit upheld the employer's right to fire a transsexual employee who used women's public restrooms despite still having male genitalia. The court recognized that the Utah Transit Authority potential liability constituted a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for releasing Etcity, despite the fact that her using a women's restroom was a non-conforming behavioral expression of her gender identity. Although a transsexual's gender identity and expression are protected, he or she must still be careful not to cross practical boundaries between the sexes. Homeless and evicted transsexuals also have hope for greater housing protection. In January 2011, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development announced new regulations that will ensure that all eligible people, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, can seek housing assistance. HUD based its decision in part of the data gathered in 2009 in the 2009 survey by the National Center of Transgender Equality and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which was evidence demonstrating the dire need for housing protections for the transgender community. The new regulations include provisions which will make clear that all HUD public housing programs are open to eligible lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender LGBT families, prohibit landlords from asking about gender identity or sexual orientation, and prohibits financial lenders from discriminating on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. In response to this monumental advancement in transgender and transsexual interests, Myra Kelsling, NCTE's executive director, said that These regulations will profoundly affect many lives because every American needs and deserves a home. The transgender community is also making headway in the healthcare arena. Transsexuals have great difficulty obtaining insurance coverage when they disclose their transsexual status or any transition-related medical history. Fortunately, some health insurers are beginning to provide coverage for transsexual procedures when there is a demonstrated need. In 2008, the American Medical Association started requesting that health insurers cover more transgender and transsexual health care needs. The Affordable Care Act also makes affording health care insurance for or receiving coverage under existing plans easier for transgender people. What the bill provides for transsexuals is increased access to insurance for a group that has great difficulty due to high rates of unemployment and poverty, protection from being denied or dropped from coverage, and bans on discrimination. Health Matrix. While this reform provides greater assistance to millions of uninsured Americans, including thousands of transsexuals, it contains no provisions covering transgender-specific treatments. Although this act does not extend protections to the extent many trans community advocates desire, this reform still significantly reduces and will hopefully eliminate the amount of discrimination transgender and transsexual people face in the medical insurance industry. These advancements demonstrate that the American people are increasingly accepting transgender and transsexual people, and the representatives and industries that serve them are also beginning to take heed. While this progress may not go as far as some might want, these are steps that, in the right direction, may provide a foundation for advancement in a number of areas, including the penal system. Eighth Amendment provisions for inmate health care. The Eighth Amendment provision provides that there shall be no cruel or unusual punishments inflicted. Try it again. The Eighth Amendment provides that there shall be no cruel or unusual punishments inflicted. The Supreme Court has stated that this amendment embodies broad and idealistic concepts of dignity, civilized standards, humanity, and decency. When the founding fathers wrote the Eighth Amendment, they could not have contemplated the specific needs of prisoners today. Indeed, their only goal in drafting the amendment was to prescribe tortures and other barbarous methods of punishment. As a result, the protections afforded to prisoners under the Eighth Amendment have necessarily expanded along the society evolving standards of decency. Distilling the 18th Amendment broad ideals, two requirements are placed in the justice and correctional systems. First, punishments are constitutional only if they are lawfully handed down by the state. Any conditions imposed by prison officials beyond what is necessary to execute that sentence are a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Second, state and federal governments have a constitutional duty to provide for inmates' basic needs, and any refusal to meet these needs is a violation of the Eighth Amendment. One district court avowed its ardent belief that the Constitution protects the inmate's right to humane treatment, not in order to found a nation that coddles criminals, but to form a society of decent people who do not allow other human beings in their custody to suffer needlessly from serious illness or injury. Standard for expanding Eighth Amendment protections. Courts recognize a strong moral and legal correlation between society standards and decency and the Eighth Amendment protections. This correlation may be helpful, if not necessary, in convincing the courts that a class or minority is constitutionally entitled to greater protections in the penal system, although it is not yet crafted a test with exacting elements. The Supreme Court has established general guidelines that help demonstrate that society has changed its perspective of the decency or humanity of specific penal conditions or punishments. The court has adjusted these guidelines in 1958 in Trop versus Dulles, where the plaintiff had lost his U.S. citizenship after being court-martialed for wartime desertion during World War II. Concerned that the Nationality Act of 1940 granted the military the power to decide who may continue to be Americans and who shall be stateless, the court determined that citizenship is not a license that expires upon misbehavior unless voluntarily relinquished or expressly abandoned by language or conduct. The court stated that punishment wielded by the state must be within the appropriate scope of the Eighth Amendment, with neither precise nor static. Accordingly, the Eighth Amendment's power and meaning is drawn from the evolving standards of the decency that marks the progress of a maturing society. The court reinstated Trop's citizenship because it found that to destroy an individual's political existence and participation in organized society is a form of punishment more primitive than torture. Later, in Gregg versus Georgia, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of capital punishment for murder and established guidelines based on moral maxim it recognized 18 years earlier. The court found an assessment of contemporary values reflected in objective indicia to be helpful, though not conclusive in evaluating certain punishments. These objective indicia include legislative response to judicial decisions made by the directly involved juries, and where the punishment comports with the basic concept of human dignity. Using these rather broad criteria, the court found that society will still place great value on capital punishment and did not rule that its use to punish the most heinous act criminals was unconstitutional. 1 year later, the Supreme Court was asked to review capital punishment constitutionally in regard to rape in Cocker versus Georgia. The court applied the analysis used in Gregg, but found that where society still accepted capital punishment for murder, it was no longer appropriate for rape. The specific findings were that legislators in many states had responded to prior judicial decisions by eliminating capital punishment for rape. At least 9 out of 10 juries did not sentence convicted rapists to death, and that death is disproportionate to the crime. The court therefore reversed Cocker's death sentence. When the courts are convinced that society as reflected by these indicia, has sufficiently altered its valuation of punishments substantially, suitably. Constitutional interpretation may shift accordingly. This standard is not limited to evaluating punishments, but extends the analysis of penological conditions that accompany the implementation of those punishments. The plaintiff can demonstrate that society places value on improving prison conditions, then the courts may ensure that prison officials properly observe inmates' new or expanded rights. Prison health care and under the Eighth Amendment. As society shifted away from quick corporal punishment in favor of longer incarcerations, prison conditions imposed on inmates became more important. Accordingly, Eighth Amendment interpretations had to adapt as well. One very important change in the Eighth Amendment jurisprudence is that it now includes a requirement that inmates receive health care from the institutions that incarcerate them. The Supreme Court determined that the principles of the Eighth Amendment requires the state to provide this care because inmates rely on those authorities for their well-being. Although prisoners have a right to health care, this right is not unlimited. Prisoners are not required to comply with all requests or expend all available resources to ensure that prisoners get every desirable comfort. Judge Posner affirmed this in Margaret v. Hanks, stating that a prison is not required by the Eighth Amendment to give a prisoner medical care that is as good as he would receive if he were a free person, let alone an affluent free person. Affluent. That's what I want to get. Affluent. Oh, never mind. Not fluent. Affluent. Don't see what it means. Having a great deal of money. Oh. And wealth. I guess depends what you call wealth, huh? While the degree of care an inmate may or should receive is always a matter of judicial discretion. There is no question that the inmate is entitled to some degree of health care. People may ask why convicts are entitled to health care when there are so many law-abiding citizens who have no access to adequate, if any, health care. The simple, though perhaps unpopular answer is that the Supreme Court has established that inmates have an affirmative constitutional right to institutionally provide health care, whereas non-incarcerated population does not. Estelle v. Gamble established the general principles that all prisoners have a constitutional right to government-funded health care for serious medical needs. Estelle addressed inmates generally, as opposed to transsexual inmates specifically. The Supreme Court reasoned that denying medical treatment may result in physical torture or a lingering death, the kind of suffering which serves no penological purpose. From this, the court established the deliberate indifference standard, which states that the deliberate indifference of
of prison authorities to serious medical needs of inmates constitutes the unnecessary and wanton infliction of pain. A finding of deliberate indifference may result from a doctor improperly treating a prisoner's needs or others officials intentionally denying, delaying, or interfering with a prisoner's access to proper treatment. However, a medical professional's decision to not pursue a particular treatment option does not by itself constitute cruel or unusual punishment. Negligence and malpractice are also insufficient to bring claim under the Eighth Amendment. The court therefore rejected Gamble's claim for lack of diagnosis and inadequate treatment on the grounds that while greater diagnoses may have been necessary, it was a medical decision not to pursue more. The prison doctors did not deny him care. They just did not do everything possible to treat his injury. This effectively established that only some treatments must be provided for serious medical needs in order to comply with the Eighth Amendment. This left open the question of how much care inmates deserve and what reaches the level of the serious medical need. Fortunately, there is no clear standard by which to make bright-line determinations. Courts have wrestled with multiple definitions of serious medical need that are similar only in that they can be easily circumvented with a plausible excuse by disinterested prison officials. The Supreme Court further eliminated the deliberate indifference standard in Farmer v. Brennan, where it considered the complaint of a preoperative male-to-female plaintiff who, despite her greater vulnerability, was placed in the prison's male general population that had a known violent environment, a history of inmate assaults. The Supreme Court decided that a prison official did not deliberately The Supreme Court decided that a prison official is not deliberately indifferent unless he knows of and disregards an excessive risk to inmate health or safety. The court further elaborated that officials must know facts from which the inference could be drawn that a substantial risk of serious harm exists, and actually draw that inference. Unfortunately, an objective standard of obviousness is inappropriate. The court held that a plaintiff need not show that the official intended the harm or knew of a specific risk, but only that the official acted despite knowing that there was a risk of harm to someone. The court, however, allowed officials to elude liability by showing that even the obvious escaped them. There are the tests that transsexual inmates must satisfy in order to obtain medical care for GID. The key issue is whether there are sufficient facts for prison officials, most likely the prison doctor, to know that the inmate is transsexual and draw the inference that the treatment for GID is needed. The question of fact may initially seem to require that the inmate prove that he or she is a transsexual suffering from GID. However, it actually requires that the prisons or prison system have medical staff available that can appropriately diagnose transsexualism, because a lay inmate cannot ground a claim on a mere self-diagnosis. Proper medical diagnosis will resolve that question of fact, provide a clear basis from which the physician can draw the required inference that the inmate requires treatment. There is, of course, no constitutional requirement to provide inmates with non-essential medical procedures. Given that many non-essential procedures are not covered by health insurance for the tax-paying public who pay the inmates' medical bills, it would be inappropriate to cover such procedures for inmates. Judge Posner viewed GID care as non-essential, saying that gender dysphoria is not generally considered a severe enough condition to warrant expensive treatment at the expense of others than the person suffering from it. Fortunately, medical science has progressed in the 15 years since Judge Posner's writing, and now 7 U.S. courts of appeals and the Supreme Court have recognized that GID qualifies as a serious medical need requiring appropriate medical attention. That alone is sufficient to warrant some treatment for diagnosed transsexuals, but the specific level of treatment required largely remains unanswered. The cases that have attempted to resolve the issue are discussed below. Current prison policies regarding transsexual inmate healthcare. Many medical uncertainties are resolved by the policies that legislators or administrative departments draft as guidance for prison officials and medical staff. These policies generally limit the medical care a prison physician can administer. The health care that transsexuals receive for GID is very restricted. The Federal Bureau of Prisons policy states, "It is the policy of the Bureau to maintain a transsexual inmate a level of change existing upon admission. Should the Bureau determine that either progressive or regressive treatment changes are indicated, the medical director must approve these prior to the implementation. The use of hormones to maintain secondary sexual characteristics may be continued at approximately the same levels as prior to incarceration, with appropriate documentation from community physicians in hospitals and with the medical director's approval. The policy and other like freezes the degree of care available to transsexual inmate. This might be acceptable for those transsexuals who were receiving treatment before incarceration, but not for inmates who might be diagnosed while in prison. In some cases, incarceration might be an inmate's first opportunity for real diagnosis and health care. While inflexible policies may seem unfavorable, having no written policy may be even worse, because it subjects transsexual inmates to the risk that officials will, with full discretion, will make decisions primarily informed by bias or other inappropriate considerations. But even if there are written policies, the degree of understanding of the policy author presents yet another problem. Despite the fact that these policies are explicitly address treatment standards for transsexual inmates suffering from GID, there is no requirement that anyone involved with the drafting process have any experience with GID care or transsexual issues. Providing transsexual inmates with the appropriate level of treatment necessitates a change in healthcare policy on both the state and federal levels. The patchwork of the state policies and troublesome adherence to those policies demonstrates the risks involved in mixing flat prohibitions and too much official discretion. The goal, therefore, should be to draft a universal policy that gives prison medical officials the latitude to provide the health care necessary to treat transsexual inmates based on their individual medical needs, but includes sufficient guidelines to balance what the inmate may request and what the doctor may provide. The policy should also be written or reviewed by the medical and legal professionals who have experience dealing with GID needs and issues. Past decisions on transsexual inmate health care and point to a better policy. Over the past 2 decades, the federal circuit courts have decided several cases dealing with treatments for inmates suffering with GID. Although not all were decided in the transsexual inmate favor, each exposed the strengths and weaknesses of current policies and official actions. These cases also highlight the remarkable differences between some care and adequate care. Taken together, these cases suggest elements for a better medical standard that balance the respective constitutional rights and duties of inmates and officials. The elements of better policy for transsexuals inmates healthcare. The first important standard for treating a transsexual inmate's serious medical need is requiring prison doctors to continue hormone treatments that the inmate pursued prior to incarceration. This requirement is not only to provide GID-specific treatment, but also to prevent the severe physical and mental withdrawal that may arise from discontinuing treatment. Delonta versus Angelone demonstrated the great dangers to an inmate's physical and mental health caused by discontinuing hormone therapy, and therefore the necessity of continuing ongoing treatments. Prior to incarceration and even to a previous facility, Delonta received estrogen, but upon transferring to another prison, the prison doctor immediately discontinued her estrogen treatment under a new state DOC policy that prohibited both medical and surgical treatment for GID. However, this new policy called for first tapering off hormone dosage before finally discontinuing hormones altogether. Cutting off the estrogen so abruptly caused both psychological and physical suffering. Delonta began to suffer from nausea and depression, developed an intense urge to mutilate herself, including attempts to auto-castration. Consequently, she brought the Eighth Amendment claim alleging denial of adequate medical treatment for GID. The district court decided that her claim was merely a disagreement over medical judgment, which is not actionable under the Eighth Amendment, and Delonta was receiving some treatment. The Fourth Circuit disagreed, stating that even if GID were not a serious medical need, the self-mutilation resulting from terminating the estrogen treatment certainly was a serious medical need requiring treatment. It also said that while some treatment was provided, counseling and antidepressants and may have alleviated the condition, it was not provided for that purpose or reasonably expected to prevent further harm. The court therefore ordered the prison to provide her constitutionally adequate treatment. This decision did not only demonstrate recognitions of GID as a serious medical need, but also that not treating GID can produce secondary serious medical needs that can be even more harmful. More importantly, this court recognized the gulf between some care and adequate care. The second element follows logically from the first. If an inmate may continue treatment for a condition he was properly diagnosed with prior to incarceration, then inmates who are diagnosed after incarceration should not be denied health care either. It also follows from this that prison officials should not deny diagnosis requests in order to avoid having to provide any treatment that might follow. In Brooks versus Berg, the plaintiff had felt that she had a female gender identity since childhood, but only became aware of GID after she was incarcerated, and realized that it was the only medical treatment that would alleviate her suffering. After repeated unanswered requests up the administrative chain of prison authority, Brooks claimed a failure to provide necessary medical treatment for her serious medical need, including diagnostic examinations. On appeal, the district court recognized that Brooks' only requests minimal through appropriate treatments and all necessary examinations testing, but that prison officials had reduced her request to just body-altering request, which was rejected. Brooks was simply requesting to see a qualified doctor who could determine what treatment, if any, was necessary. The court noted that the prison officials was also misinterpreted the Federal Bureau of Prisons drafted policy of silence regarding whether previously undiagnosed inmates could receive treatment as a prohibition on providing care to transsexuals diagnosed in prison. Inmates diagnosed with other physical or mental illnesses are not denied treatment simply because their conditions are not diagnosed prior to incarceration. The court concluded that a blanket denial of medical treatment is contrary to the 8th Amendment. This decision placed an obligation on prison officials to provide inmates diagnostic examinations in order to determine whether a serious medical need that requires a treatment is indicated. A necessary corollary of this rule is that when an inmate is not diagnosed as a transsexual suffering from GID or as not needing a particular treatment, there is no 8th Amendment violation for denying that inmate desired care. A Praylor versus Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the plaintiff claimed that he was unconstitutionally denied treatment for the GID. The court rejected his claim because prison officials demonstrated the Praylor did not qualify for medical treatment under the prison's policy for treating transsexual inmates. The officials also demonstrated that providing hormones would interfere with prison security and that psychotherapy treatment was available to transsexual inmates. Judging from the policy, which required psychological screening of transsexual inmates and hormone therapy only for medical necessity, diagnostic tools used by WPATH standards of care and experienced officials was involved in the determination. Brooks also speaks to the final element of a better universal policy, ensuring that appropriate prison officials make the decisions concerning transsexual inmates' health care. In requiring diagnostic examinations, the court stated further that a medical professional and not a lay administrator must determine any treatment for the inmate patient. Furthermore, treatment decisions, whether to provide or deny care, must be based on the sound medical judgment of the medical professional. The court noted that even Brooks, who believed that a wide variety of surgeries may be appropriate, recognized what the prison officials did not, and that only a qualified medical professional could determine that treatment was minimal though appropriate. This standard arose from a decision the the previous year in Kozelik and Maloney, where the court stated that adequate care meant treatment by qualified personnel in accordance with prudent professional standards in the community. However, the court recognized that other prudent and practical concerns, such as the need to maintain security and safety, might override the inmate's constitutional right to GID treatment. But if an official decided that his duty to ensure an inmate's safety must override the duty to provide the adequate care to that inmate, only a court can decide whether there is an Eighth Amendment violation. While this standard does not grant the absolute right to adequate care, it still protects inmates' patients from decisions based on inappropriate considerations or troublesome interpretations of official policy or medical practice. Cost is not grounds for denying treatment. When legal arguments are exhausted, some prison officials try defending their decisions to deny medical treatment on practical grounds. Judge Posner in Margaret v. Hanks asserted that prisons had no duty to provide treatments for GID in part because they are protracted and expensive procedures, and the cost of full transformation can reach up to $100,000 for male to female procedures. In support of some judicial determinations that attending physicians are solely responsible for healthcare decisions, medical advocates are quick to point out that doctors are trained to not consider cost or pass judgment as to whether the patient deserves the treatment. Leaving medical decisions to those concerning with the budget only ensures that needless suffering will ensue. This would also violate the sound medical judgment standards established in Brooks. Furthermore, prisons readily provide other costly procedures to inmates. In 2005, the DOC estimated that one coronary bypass cost $37,000 and one kidney transplant cost $33,000, where it estimated that complex sex reassignment would only cost $20,000. In 2004, DOC paid only $2,300 for hormone therapy for 2 inmates, but paid $2.5 million for inmates to take antipsychotic drugs, providing inexpensive procedures such as those, but denying substantially less inexpensive and intensive treatments like hormone therapy, appears to be a decision based on considerations other than patients' medical needs or even cost. This also clearly violates the Brooks standards. Fortunately, at least one federal court has completely foreclosed prison officials from taking a particular treatment cost into account when deciding what care is available to an inmate. In Kozelik v. Maloney, the plaintiff was a transsexual who suffered from depression that led to suicide and autocastration attempts. Having been denied care by Maloney, Kozelik filed suit against him in his official capacity as the DOC commissioner, asking the courts for provisions that would be made obligatory to a year later in Brooks. Kozelik simply wanted a doctor experienced with GID to diagnose and prescribe adequate treatment and for the prison officials to provide that treatment. Unlike in Brooks and Delonta and versus Angelone, Maloney adopted his own policy for GID care that froze care upon incarceration. Maloney adopted his policy due to a variety of administrative concerns, security, public and political criticism, and that GID treatments may be an inappropriate use of taxpayer money. The court recognized that the security is a legitimate concern, but declared that it is impermissible to deny an inmate adequate medical care because it is costly. If Maloney denied Kozelik adequate care for GID based on the cost or controversy, he violated the Eighth Amendment. This outcome protects transsexual inmate patients from administrative decisions based on inappropriate considerations and compels prison officials to rely on the sound medical judgment of experienced medical professionals for diagnosis and treatment. Even if cost was a legitimate concern for prison administrators, the care that is currently accessible, the care that would be accessible under a more reliable standard described below, is not cost prohibitive because of four important limiting factors. First, to receive treatment, a prison doctor must diagnose an inmate patient as a transsexual suffering from GID. Second, the quantum of the diagnosed transsexual inmates is minuscule. Third, not all transsexual prisoners will want treatment or have the same medical needs. Fourth, despite Judge Posner's concerns, given the safety risks, it is unreasonable to assume that transsexuals will commit crimes just to receive medical treatment. With enforceable diagnosis guidelines, low numbers, variable need, and no incentive to abuse the system, even if all transsexual inmates were provided greater care, the total cost would not be prohibitive compared to the rest of the healthcare budget. These medical and cost considerations form a strong foundation for a better policy. These are broad ideals that do not prohibit in refinement. As greater scientific understanding of transsexualism develops and medical treatments improve, a policy built on this foundation will meet an inmate's specific medical needs and provide proper guidance to prison officials as to when treatment must be provided. It will also conform to both the medical consensus on GID treatment as codified in the standards of care, and balance the inmate's constitutional rights with the prison officials' constitutional duties. Courts, therefore, only need to be convinced that such a policy is effective at treating GID, that society values its implementations. The Eighth Amendment requires gender identity disorder treatment. The Eighth Amendment requires care for prisoners' basic needs is clear. While treatment for GID may not seem like a basic need, adequate medical treatment for serious medical needs certainly is. Estelle v. Gamble established that prison officials must provide only some care, but some care might practically mean no care. If that care does not adequately or effectively address the severity or the serious medical need, while there is no constitutional requirement that treatment must cure an inmate's conditions or illnesses, the care provided must at least mitigate the inmate's suffering while he or she is in the state's custody. The duties imposed in prison officials by this requirement for appropriate mitigation care may be interpreted in two ways. One interpretation says that at least a minimum of adequate care is required. This provides a lower limit for a degree of care officials must provide, below which is a denial of care that constitutes unnecessary and wanton infliction of pain. However, it does not establish an upper limit on care that inmates may demand. This interpretation therefore conflicts with the Supreme Court's qualification to the deliberate indifferences standard that medical judgments not to pursue a particular treatment are not grounds for a claim. The second, and perhaps more appropriate, interpretation of the Eighth Amendment requires only the minimum treatment required to effectively treat the condition. This maintains the lower limit needed to protect inmates' constitutional rights. In fact, it may raise it slightly. However, it caps treatment at the point where the serious medical problems has been cured or substantially alleviated. This view is in accordance with the tax court's disbelief that the treatment should bear a direct or proximate therapeutic relation to the need. This is also a flexible policy in line with the standards of care that meets the patient's specific needs. If a transsexual inmate requires only psychiatric therapy to alleviate GAD, then that is all that the Eighth Amendment requires, and all that prison officials must provide. However, if in another case the inmate cannot be adequately treated with psychiatric therapy, then upon a proper diagnosis, hormones should be provided. The Ninth Circuit used a standard for adequate care regarding other aspects of inmate care that reflects many of the same values as a second interpretation. In Johnson v. Lewis, the plaintiff's inmates suing as a class alleged that their Eighth Amendment right to official provisions for their basic needs was violated. Excuse me. On two occasions, following prison unrest, the inmates were kept out in the yard, exposed to extreme elements with few provisions for protection, waste, hygiene, or nourishment for extended periods of time. The district court rejected their claim under the standard of care similar to that expressed in Estelle and Gamble, because the prison officials had provided some protections from the elements: food, water, medical care, and sanitation. They were not liable for violating their Eighth Amendment duties because they did not cause sufficient harm. On appeal, in Ninth Circuit reversed the district court because the prison officials meeting some needs at some times did not establish that sufficient or the adequate care was in fact provided. While the officials were not obligated to provide every possible amenity, they had a duty to meet the inmates' basic needs. The Tenth Circuit went a little further, holding that a prison official may be liable when he makes efforts reasonably calculated to reduce the risk of harm that fail if he intentionally refuses reasonable alternatives and the risk continues, applying this to transsexual inmate patients. If the prison doctor provides psychotherapy, but the inmate's depression or urges for self-mutilations continue, the doctor may be liable under the Eighth Amendment for not providing the hormones necessary to alleviate the suffering. A narrower interpretation of the Eighth Amendment is most appropriate for advancing transsexual inmates' health care interests. Although it may eliminate access to surgical sex reassignment, it strengthens the right to sex-appropriate hormone therapy. Using this interpretation in conjunction with the case law discussed above, a better law for treating inmates with GID can be crafted. Sound medical diagnosis without discrimination. Inmates have any constitutional right to the care they need. The first step to protecting that right is ensuring that prison officials can provide the proper treatment without judicial intervention. The sooner the inmate's medical condition is treated, the less pain and suffering the inmate will experience. Prison officials can only treat a serious medical need if it has been diagnosed by an experienced medical professional. An inmate's right to sound medical diagnosis was recognized by Brooks versus Berg, but the court in Brooks left open the questions of what is sound medical judgment and what is an experienced medical professional. W-PATH standards of care state that in treating patients with GID, an experienced medical professional, at the very least in one who has basic general clinical competence in diagnosis and treatment of mental and emotional disorders. Specialization experience with GID requires an advanced degree in clinical behavior science, specialized training in assessing DSM-4 sexual disorders, especially those disorders that implicate Eighth Amendment concerns, such as GID, competence in psychotherapy, and continuing GID treatment education. These are the minimum requirements for competently Ooh, it's a mess, Georgie. If these are the minimum requirements for competently diagnosing and treating GID patients, it stands to reason that only a medical professional possessing these qualifications has the sound medical judgment required to treat a transsexual inmate. Furthermore, given the standard of care, W-PATH's interpretations for the international medical community's consensus on GID treatment, sound medical judgment for treating a transsexual inmate must reflect the standards of care, through balance against the legitimate practical concerns of the prison environment. If examined by a qualified medical professional, a diagnosis is simple, better, and only requires meeting the clinical threshold described in the standards of care, and comparing the patient's indicated symptoms to the DSM-4 guidelines. Another open question is which prisoners are entitled to a diagnosis. All inmates who feel that they have a gender-sex incongruity are entitled to be examined by a medical professional, and if indicated, diagnosed as a transsexual. There are two key reasons for requiring universal access to sound medical diagnosis. First, as stated above, an undiagnosed serious medical need cannot be treated. Second, many transsexuals only come to terms with their true gender identity during midlife. In some cases, prison might be the first time these inmates have access to real health care and the opportunity to have any medical problems diagnosed and treated. In any case, though, it would be wrong for prison officials to deny an inmate the opportunity to be examined in order to avoid treating a serious medical need. It is important to note, however, that a medical examination will not necessarily yield a GID diagnosis. If upon examination the inmate is diagnosed as suffering from GID, the medical professional has an array of effective, though limited, treatment options at his disposal to which the patient may then be constitutionally entitled. Psychotherapy is some care, but not necessarily adequate care. Psychotherapy is the first and least intensive treatment for GID. As prescribed by the W-PATH standards of care, the standards of care state that not all transsexuals require every step of the treatment sequence to become comfortable with their incongruity, and that not all will require psychotherapy to move on to the hormone treatment. A real therapeutic value of psychotherapy is that it aids the discovery and maturational process that enables self-comfort. However, despite the valuable role it plays in providing comfort, psychotherapy is not a cure for GID. This is evident from the fact that many transsexuals still pursue the more intensive hormonal and surgical therapies despite successful psychotherapy. It has also been demonstrated in many of the cases discussed above. For example, Odenalvian only found relief after starting hormone treatment. Delonta experienced severe psychological deterioration after being denied hormones despite the fact that psychotherapy was available. But Praler had to be satisfied with only psychotherapy because he was not diagnosed as needing anything more. Despite rejecting arguments that prisons have a duty to provide extensive care for GID, even Judge Posner pointed out while less drastic treatments are available for this condition, only the more intensive treatments have been successful in treating it. Given the psychotherapy is not very intensive, relatively easy to provide, and unlike to create security concerns, prison officials routinely provide it to transsexual inmates, prescribing hormones following sound medical diagnosis. According to the WPATH protocols, following psychotherapy, gender-specific hormones are the next level of treatment. The standards of care place great emphasis on hormone therapy due to its proven medical effectiveness and widespread patient satisfaction with the results. Hormones are generally necessary for successful living in the new gender and for reducing psychiatric comorbidity. Hormones alleviate GID symptoms, but altering physical characteristics to align the desired gender. In many, if not most cases, hormones are sufficient to relieve GID symptoms, thereby removing the need to pursue the more intensive and permanent surgeries. Being incarcerated is an abrupt life change, and it presents many health risks to transsexuals. The standards of care insist that hormone treatment should not be discontinued. Discontinuing hormone therapy can cause emotional instability, regression of hormonal-induced physical changes, and severe psychological problems, including depression, anxiety, and suicidality. Rapid discontinuation may cause even more severe health risks. The cases discussed above in parts 3b and 3d have also clearly demonstrated the troubles transsexual inmates experience when they are denied hormone therapy. Fortunately, many courts have recognized the value that hormone therapy has for transsexuals suffering from GID. Given the demonstrable effectiveness of hormone therapy and the risk of denying it, the Eighth Amendment must provide the prison medical personnel prescribe sex-appropriate hormones to all diagnosed transsexual inmate patients. This does not mean that all transsexuals are automatically entitled to hormones. The Eighth Amendment only requires effective treatment for a serious medical need. The inmate must actually have a serious medical need diagnosed by a medical professional. Not providing treatment to one who has not been diagnosed as a serious and treatable medical condition does not violate the Eighth Amendment. All inmates diagnosed with GID should have access to the necessary treatments. Prisons are currently only required to provide hormones to those who medically qualify, but is inconsistent with the principles embodied in the Eighth Amendment to universally deny these treatments to all transsexuals. Sex reassignment surgery is not required. Currently, no prison facilities in the United States have policies that provide sex reassignment surgeries, SRS. either genital or non-genital, to transsexual inmates, based on a gender that only requires minimum effective treatments and not fully curing long-term conditions. SRS beyond the medical needs of most transsexual inmates. The minimum effective requirement limitless prisoners claimless because the treatment provided should not exceed that which is necessary to alleviate or cure the condition while the inmate is incarcerated. This comports with the Estelle qualification that a medical decision not to pursue a treatment option does not violate the Eighth Amendment, and Posner's opinion that prisoners should not receive care that is generally unavailable to non-incarcerated persons. SRS is not medically available or necessary for many transsexuals, and due to prejudice, prejudicial difficulties in the workplace. Prejudicial difficulties in the workplace. I'm sorry there. I sound like a scratch this. Just want to make sure I pronounce it properly. More better at least. Many cannot even afford it. Surgery is not necessary for all GID cases, and the WPATH standards of care recommend reserving it for only the most serious cases. Most transsexuals are able to successfully complete their transitions without it. Hormones alleviate most symptoms and ease suffering without causing serious complications, except for when those hormones are discontinued. Surgery creates a much greater risk of harm. Although desperate transsexuals may believe that surgery is a life-saving measure, the Eighth Amendment does not require it. There is also significant issues beyond medical necessities. The effectiveness of surgical procedures for GID patients is still under study. Furthermore, the many post-operative complications that may follow give rise to both physical and legal problems. While a well-performed surgery may itself entail little risk for the patient, the potential future health complications can be severe. Surgery does not necessarily produce fully functional sex organs, and some genital constructions may detach or collapse, requiring extensive reconstruction to repair the damage. To require SRS to put officials in a constitutional bind. If the Eighth Amendment prohibits conduct that may cause a prisoner to suffer, it should not require a drastic treatment that may lead to harm or illness for the inmate. A study published in 2011 followed post-operative transsexuals in Sweden revealed many problems plaguing transsexuals who completed SRS. The study stated that prior data concerning post-operative transsexuals was inconsistent and inconclusive, with some reporting improvement both psychiatrically and physiologically following hormone therapy and SRS, and others reporting regrets, psychiatric morbidity, and suicide attempts. Following 324 Swedish transsexuals who had SRS over the 30-year period, a study reported that these individuals had 3 times the risk of death, higher risk of suicide, cardiovascular disease, malignancies, increased risk of hospitalization for non-GID psychiatric disorders, and greater rates of conviction than the general population. The authors suggested that post-operative transsexuals have greater health problems because many avoid the health care system out of fear of discrimination, and that they generally had more psychiatric ill health than the general population prior to the sex reassignment, which may continue even after successful transformation. Refusing SRS to inmates is inconsistent with the Oldenian decision. However, there is a difference between IRC 213 and the 8th Amendment. Section 213 allows tax deductions for all effective treatments for GID. There is no cap for 213 allowances as long as the expenses relate medically effective procedures. The 8th Amendment, however, does not require therapies that exceed what is necessary to treat the inmate's condition while he or she is incarcerated. An exception may be permissible for inmates sentenced to life without parole. The WPATH standards of care require a successful 12-month minimum life experience in order to qualify for SRS. This is a test for how well the transsexual individual functions in society as the intended sex. For life prisoners, the prison is their life experience, and it is the community in which they will live and die. Given how rare these cases are, they may be little harm to extending the degree of care. Therefore, the standard that the long-term condition need to be cured in prison may be relaxed because the inmate may never find medical relief outside. Appropriate housing for transsexual inmates. If sex-altering treatment is provided, transsexual inmates will require special housing accommodations to protect them from inmate predation. Although Judge Posner rejected pleas of medical relief, he recognized the physical dangers associated with being a transsexual and affirmed the right to protection from harassment by prisoners who wish to use transsexual inmates as a sexual plaything. Unfortunately, housing for transsexual inmates presents a confusing paradox because all available options present constitutional problems. Placing transsexual inmates in the general population creates a serious risk of violent assault, but placing those inmates in administrative segregation for protection may punish them beyond the sentences for their crimes. As one commenter stated, prison rapes do not occur in a vacuum. Prison society operates according to a code that divides the strong from the weak and the dominant from the subjugated along lines of fighting ability and manliness. Weaker or more stereotypical feminine inmates are at the bottom of the prison society at the highest risk of victimization. The threat of sexual violence in prison is so well recognized that Congress passed legislation to combat it, the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003. The Act's findings estimated that in 20 years prior to enactment, over 1 million inmates had suffered some form of sexual abuse, and that inmates with mental conditions or illnesses were especially susceptible to attack. Transsexuals are at substantially greater risk of violent and sexual assault in prison due to their femininity and gender non-conforming behavior or appearance. A survey of California prisons revealed that 59% of transgender inmates reported sexual assault compared to just 4% of general population. A national survey reported that 16% were physically assaulted and 15% sexually assaulted. Administrative segregation, as the name implies, is commonly used for punishing misbehaving inmates or isolating the most dangerous convicts. Placing transsexual inmates in an administrative segregation because of their transsexual status and not for any misconduct, even if it is for their protection, effectively punishes them for being transsexual. It is punishment because it denies them the privileges such as socializing with others and outdoors activities that the general population enjoys. It begs the question of why the perpetrators of violent assaults are not segregated instead in order to protect the vulnerable inmates. If the violent inmates are segregated from society because they could not properly function in it, they should also be removed from the general prison population for violating its integrity and security as well. The most likely answer is that it is easier this way because there are fewer victims than predators. As with medical care, an official's constitutional duty to provide security to all inmates may override a single inmate's constitutional rights. A common sentiment may be that if the inmate did not want to risk the dangers of prison, then he should not have committed the crime. However, the dangers of physical and sexual assault are not an inherent condition of institutional incarceration, and are not part of the state's sentence for the crime. The sentence time to be served is the extent of the state's lawful punishment. The Eighth Amendment's role is to ensure that the state and the deputies charged the carrying out sentence upheld that ideal. If these risks were factored in, then the sentences ought to be shortened. Some suggest that a way to avoid these risks is to house transsexual inmates according to their subject gender rather than their objective gender. However, this does not entirely eliminate the risk, and it raises serious questions about privacy rights for the objectively female inmates. No court has decisively ruled on this point, but it is not entirely unheard of for a preoperative transsexual to be housed accordingly to subject gender identity rather than the physical sex. In 2009, Jasmine Anderson, an objectively male transsexual, was imprisoned for selling drugs. Although initially housed in a male facility, she was eventually transferred to a women's facility in northern Ohio. This is certainly the exception rather than the rule, but it is encouraging that prison officials are making exceptions for inmates who need special accommodation. A more progressive but controversial plan would be to have transsexual-only facilities. Though it may sound impractical, Italy has established a prison specifically to house transgender inmates. It was not a huge undertaking, housing only 30 transgender inmates in a former prison for women in Italy's most famous transsexual, a former member of the parliament, believed that the prison allowed these inmates to serve their time without being persecuted for their sexual identity. Given the small number of transsexual prisoners, a similar program in the United States would be less financially burdensome than politically untenable. Physical security is not only an interest for transsexual inmates, but a constitutional right. It is also in society's best interest to keep prisoners safe from violence at hands of fellow inmates, because brutalized inmates are more likely to commit crimes than released. because they suffer severe physical and psychological effects that hinder their ability to integrate into the community and maintain stable employment. With difficulty finding employment, inmates who are brutalized in prison are more likely to become homeless or require government assistance and have higher rates of recidivism. I don't know what that means anymore. A tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend. Recidivism. Improving healthcare along with safe housing may promote rehabilitation more than anything else for transsexual inmates. Given that many transsexual inmates were given to crime to survive or pay. Given that many transsexual inmates were driven to crime to survive or to pay for some form of treatment, providing adequate treatment and protecting them from victimization may help them successfully reintegrate into society as a desired gender and thereby prevent recidivism. If the Odinavian standard influences the way courts treat transsexual inmates, then new housing protocols must be established to protect inmates. The Eighth Amendment prohibits convicted prison officials to put inmates at risk of harm. If seeking medical treatment would put the inmate at risk of some other physical harm, then the Eighth Amendment is providing for that medical treatment must also compel other protections to prevent any harm from other inmates reacting to that treatment. If this were not true, then the Eighth Amendment protections would become paradoxical or impossible for prison officials to uphold in practice, and would unfairly force inmates to decide which right is most important to them. Some compromise must be found that can adequately serve both interests, because transsexual inmates should not be forced to choose between treating their serious medical need and suffering at the hands of predators. Conclusion. Transsexualism has been recognized as a serious medical need. Accordingly, under Estelle v. Gamble, prisoners diagnosed as transsexual have a constitutional protected right to adequate medical care under the Eighth Amendment. The American public has recognized that transgender and transsexual individuals are a social and sexual minority deserving increased legal and institutional protections. It is only right, constitutionally and morally, that these greater protections granted by federal and state governments extend to transsexuals in the carceral care of those governments. After all, inmates are constitutionally entitled to state-provided health care, whereas populations at large is not. For many years, proposals regarding adequate care for transsexuals have been debated by advocacy groups and commentators. While these are valuable efforts, courts are not required to excuse to every demand to change the law. Hopefully the opinion of forward-thinking administrative tax court, when coupled with strong demonstrations of evolving social expectations, will carry more weight in analysis of what treatment transsexual inmates are entitled to. The Odinavian court decided that if there is a legitimate and serious medical need, and the treatment bears a direct or proximate therapeutic relation to that need, a transgender individual is entitled to the tax benefit for the medical expenses. Translated to the Eighth Amendment, context, it should mean that the level of care that properly diagnosed transsexual inmates receive is adequate for the severity of their GID. Inmates who feel that they have an incongruity between their gender and sex are, at the very least, entitled to medical examination to determine whether they are in fact transsexual. If sound medical judgment indicates that a transsexual diagnosis, then the care is required. If the medical judgment determines that the inmate only requires psychotherapy, then that is all that the inmate is entitled to. But if another inmate requires more, the care provided should not be limited by non-medical concerns or the fact that another inmate required less intensive care. Consequently, if a prison official relies on sound medical judgment, the compelling inmate does not have an Eighth Amendment claim. If sex-altering treatment is provided, appropriate steps must be taken to protect the inmate from predation. Our social and cultural predilection for a gender binary system and shunning of criminals should not lead us to deny transsexual inmates proper treatment. Indeed, they are criminals, but the sentence the justice system imposed was to the extent of our moral condemnation of their actions. Denying them the adequate treatment for GID is punishing them not for their crimes, but for their medical conditions. Offending cultural norms is not offending society's laws. Punishing the former certainly constitutes a cruel and unusual punishment. More importantly, if we can rehabilitate transgender inmates in both the medical and social sense, perhaps they will not return to prison. The relationship between society's evolving standards of decency and the Eighth Amendment provision is always subject to change. Change has occurred. It is time that constitutional interpretations mirror that evolution. The hope now is to find a court willing to take the leap. Copyright The Health Matrix. Journal of the Law of Medicine. It's property of the Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and its consent may not be copied or emailed to multiple sites or posted to a listery without copyright holders' express written permission. However, users may print, download, or email articles for individuals' use. So, I might put this up on YouTube. I hope you guys don't get angry. But, I think it's beneficial to get your words out there. So, thank you for helping me with this project, this essay, and I hope you guys enjoyed this article or excerpt from Travis Wright, Colopy, Setting Gender Identity Free, Expanding Treatment for Transsexual Inmates.